So we're pleased to be here today with Jeff Munroe, who is Executive Vice President of the Western Theological Seminary and author of an upcoming book about Frederick Buechner. The name of the book is Reading Buechner, Exploring the Work of a Master Memoirist, Novelist, Theologian, and Preacher, which I think is a good summary of the many different aspects of Mr. Buechner's work.
Yeah.
So Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be here.
So for someone who's unfamiliar with Frederick Buechner's work, how would you describe him?
You know the first thing I usually say is perhaps the greatest spiritual writer of the last half of the previous century. He's the only ordained minister who's ever been nominated for either and both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize in fiction. So he did that as a novelist. He's really the godfather, I think, of today's spiritual memoir movement. So many writers today really owe a debt to him and acknowledge that debt to him. So just a very, very significant writer.
So what are the most significant themes that Buechner wrote about?
You know, there are a lot. I'll focus on four, and I'll do one for each of the genres. You mentioned in the long subtitle of the book that highlights each of these genres that I look at in my book. And so as a memoirist, I believe his primary theme is listen to your life. Look for a plot that your life may have, and be alive and look for what he calls the subterranean presence of grace, for the ways that God is moving and that God is speaking, even in the most ordinary of times and of moments. Then as the novelist, I would say the primary theme is it possible? Is it possible, despite all the evidence to the contrary? Is it possible to use a line from another great writer, from Wendell Berry, is it possible once you've considered all the facts to believe? Is it possible in our world to believe? That's really what I think the theme that the novels all kind of turn on. And then as a theologian, and I use a phrase, I call him a popular theologian. He doesn't write theology academically. He writes theology for broad audiences. But I think his work there, the theme would be, how do we revive tired language, churchy language, theological language, words that have lost their meaning, that have become cliches over time? How do we refresh and renew those things? And then as a preacher, because he's also one of our great preachers, it's really to recognize that the audience, your congregation, has one question on their minds, and the question is it true? Could what you're saying, could this story about God possibly be true? So to have the courage as a preacher to ask that question and to explore that question in what you do.
I think those are excellent summaries, Jeff. I'm really looking forward to this book. I think it's just going to be wonderful.
Thanks, Brian.
So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the story of how this book came about.
Well, this is a great story, Brian, because you're in it. And so this is going to be a shameless plug for everybody to go to one of your writing conferences.
Oh, good.
This book came out of one of your writing conferences, and you and I have known each other for many years, and you invited me to go to a writing conference that Princeton was hosting, Princeton Theological Seminary, and it was called the Frederick Buechner Writing Conference, and you invited me to go there and to talk about Frederick Buechner. So I did that, and the day I did my presentation, there was a guy sat right in the front, and I could tell he was kind of tracking with everything I was saying, was nodding a lot and seemed to be enjoying it. And afterwards, he came up to me, introduced himself. His name was Jeff Crosby, and he is the publisher of InterVarsity Press. And a day or so later, he said, well, did you see what I posted on Facebook? And I said, no, I didn't see that. And he said, well, I posted how much I enjoyed your seminar about Frederick Buechner. And I said, thanks. And then he said, somebody wrote, get him to write a book about it. And Jeff wrote something like, I intend to. And so that was, wow, that just came out of the blue to me. And then also at that conference, Jeff was doing a presentation on nonfiction book proposals. And I had not planned to go to that. I wasn't going to go to that seminar. And then after he said what he said to me, I thought, geez, I better go to that seminar. So I did. I went to a seminar and I took copious notes and then did a proposal, wrote a proposal for IVP. And it was accepted. And so I've worked on it now for the last 2 years. But the moral of the story, the lesson is go to Brian Elaine's writing conference. Great things can happen there. You meet people there. You really do. And so that's the great thing about your conferences, Brian, is that you make it possible for people to get connected with people in the world of publishing.
Well, thank you, Jeff. But it really speaks to the power of relationship building.
Yeah.
And conferences like that certainly are really good for networking, relationship building. And, I'm so happy that happened.
Me too.
So why would you say that this book is important right now, given what's going on in our culture?
Yeah. Well, what is going on in our culture, right? The word I would use, this is a no-brainer. The word I would use is polarized. Everything pushes us, it seems like, in one direction or the other. To the right, I'm pushing my left hand as I say to the right, to the left or to the right. And I think that we really seek to catalog, to categorize, to kind of put everything into its place and to leave it there. And I would say that Frederick Buechner defies categorization. I can't decide, for example, I can't decide, and I say this in the book, I can't decide if he's a liberal conservative or a conservative liberal. I can't decide if he's a Pentecostal mainliner or a mainline Pentecostal, because he has all these strands in him. And so he transcends the moment. His work isn't a binary choice. I think that's really significant right now. The other thing that I would say is, and this is especially true with the memoirs and why I think his memoirs are so important and why I consider him I mentioned, I think, the godfather of the modern spiritual memoir movement. I think life today is more complicated than it's ever been. And with the rise of technology, with so many distractions, with the upheaval and unrest that's going on around us all the time. And I look at those memoirs as I think that they provide equipment for living, that they show us the way. And I think we're really drawn to that, drawn to looking at how others have found a way, have made sense of their life. And especially with Buechner, and I probably should have mentioned this as a theme, but how do we deal with trauma? How do we deal with traumatic things that have happened in our lives? And he's written so beautifully about that. The big trauma for him was the suicide of his father when he was 10 years old, when Buechner was 10 years old. So that's a major part of it as well.
So you've touched on this a little bit already, but tell us a little bit about how the book is organized and what angles do you approach Buechner's writing from?
Yeah, so there are 40 Buechner books, and if you're new to Buechner, I think the question is, where do you start, right? If there are 40, you don't want to read the clunker, right? They're all good, but you don't want to read the worst one. You want to read the great ones. So what I do is I choose 10 books that I have called the essential books. And I write a chapter on each of those books. And I've separated those into those 4 genres that I mentioned. So there's memoir, novel, popular theology, and preaching. And And then in addition, I have an appendix that looks at every book. So there's a little brief description of every book. So hopefully my book can be a guide. It'll help people in, and then also be a reference that if you're looking at and saying, oh, I wonder what's in this book by Buechner, Speak What We Feel, for example, or The Clown in the Belfry. I've got a little description of it, and you can see, hey, do I want to pick this one up? Is that something that I'd enjoy reading?
So when I was director of the Frederick Buechner Center, I mean, I got asked oftentimes, which is the book I should read first.
Right.
And so before I answer that question, what's your answer to that question?
Well, you should read my book first. What I tell people is I really actually think the memoir Telling Secrets is probably the best introduction. It's not the way that I got introduced. And so there are multiple ways to come to Buechner, and I've heard lots of different stories. The book Telling the Truth, the Gospel is tragedy, comedy, fairy tale is also a great, that's the first one I read. That's also a great way in. The novel Godric is a great way in. There's plenty of them. But maybe one of those three would be the ones I'd say.
Interesting. So
all of them work.
That's different than what my answer has been.
Okay.
So.
what was your answer, Brian?
So my answer was The Sacred Journey first.
Okay.
Because it's just so foundational.
Yeah.
Sets the context for, I think everything else he wrote, largely speaking.
That's good too.
Yeah, that's good too.
That works as well. Yep.
And then, I tell people, then if you're into nonfiction like I am, Secrets in the Dark, which is his compilation of greatest hits of his sermons, basically.
Right.
To me, was just, a very personally meaningful book. So I say, if you're really into nonfiction, go there. If you're into fiction, go to Godric.
Yeah.
But that's just, like you said, he's written 40 books, and so many of them are just amazing. So it is kind of difficult to narrow it down.
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of treasures to be mined.
So Jeff, you've faced some, trying times even this year with your cancer diagnosis. How would you say that Buechner has spoken to you through everything that's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm doing fine, by the way. I had surgery this summer, and everything's good with me. But, the introduction in my book, I describe a traumatic event that happened in my life a few decades ago, and how an essay by Buechner called Adolescence and the Stewardship of Pain really helped me make sense of life after this traumatic event had happened. This idea that he has of the stewardship of pain, he takes the parable of the talents in Matthew 25 and asks the question, what if pain is like a talent that we're given? And what do we do with it? And what's it mean to trade with it? And then the one steward, or the one servant, buries it. And so, that's always kind of the temptation with trauma, is to bury your pain, is to try to pretend it doesn't exist. And that's what I write about in the introduction. The irony is that as I completed the manuscript, I was diagnosed with cancer. And so there's a question of what I actually believe. Do I actually believe what I just wrote about? Would I open myself to fully experience what was happening, or would I bury my feelings again instead? And on a side note, the book has a foreword by the artist Mako Fujimura. And he writes about his experience with trauma, especially on September 11th, 2001. He was living in an apartment that was 3 blocks away from the World Trade Center. And how something he read by Buechner in the months that followed that trauma really changed his life. And so, that's a huge theme. Also, I mentioned that how we work through trauma is a huge theme. It also, I'm digressing a little bit, but it also occurs to me that suicide is a huge theme too, because he's open. He writes about it openly, and that's another thing that all the statistics are that suicide rates are increasing, not decreasing in our culture. My little piece of the world, in the town where I live, in my church, in our school, we've been touched in the last year by 2 suicides. So it's a topic that we really struggle to be open and to talk about, but Buechner's a way into that topic as well.
So Jeff, you've written a lot, but they've been shorter pieces. This is your first full-length book. What was surprising, challenging about that process?
Yeah, I could get really nerdy and technical here, but what I would say is the biggest challenge was keeping it all organized, to do something and to write over the course of months, instead of a few days, and to realize sometimes I would write a paragraph and I would think, boy, I just got that. I just said that exactly the way I wanted to say it. And then I would look at a chapter that I'd written 3 months ago and realize I already said that. I'm repeating myself. So the challenge of not repeating yourself. Another thing, just to be vulnerable with you, is I think you get about a third of the way through and you wonder, is any of this any good? So, you have this great temptation. I saw, somebody sent me a cartoon from the New Yorker the other day. It was a guy, he's got his barbecue grill thing going, in the backyard, and he's got a book burning on the grill, and his wife comes out with a couple of drinks and she said, "How's the new book coming?" And so I think we all feel like that. Is it any good? So you struggle a little bit with self-confidence along the way. The other thing I would say is I used to think I had a good memory until I did this, and just remembering, I would be writing and I would think, there's a quote that I want to use, and then I would sit there and I would say to myself, where is that quote? I know it's in. Is it in one of the books? Is it in an interview with him that I've read, in an article that he did? So what you understand is why people like David McCulloch have research assistants that organize all those things. And I think there are apps and things like that people can use to help organize their stuff. I didn't have that. I would have, while I was writing, it was not unusual for me to have, just around the place where I was working, to have 8, 10, 15 Buechner books and other books open around there, piles of articles, different things that I put together. It's a huge mess all the time. So that, I don't know if that's interesting or not, but that as a writer, that became the real challenge, is just keeping it all together, because you have a word count to fulfill from the publisher. And then final thing I'll just say is that word count becomes a challenge. It was not a challenge, and I doubt it's a challenge for many people to get to the word count. The challenge is to say what you want to say and not go 20,000 words over, or 30,000 words over the word count that they've given you by the time you put everything together. So there's an old Mark Twain quote where he says, what's he say? I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one. The discipline of making your writing precise and concise is what matters in the end. And so that's another big part of the challenge.
Well, I think, the different things that you mentioned have been consistent with what I've heard many other authors say. Yeah. Many folks are afflicted by the imposter syndrome. Yeah. And also, your commentary about the difficulty of being succinct, which again, quite frankly, was one of Buechner's incredibly strong gifts.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all these great books that weigh in at about 100 pages. So that makes them so accessible, because they're not these massive tomes, but he says so much. with this great economy of words is something that you just, you look at and you admire, that he had so much talent and skill.
His ability to be both profound and succinct was just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about some of the details here now. When's the actual release date?
The release date is November 19th. It's InterVarsity Press. You can find it at ivp.com. It will be on Amazon and every place else also, but that's what's coming.
Do you know when pre-orders will begin to be taken?
I think that actually you can do that now through their website.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, we will definitely, start getting the word out to tell people about this. I think it's just going to be a very exciting book. I think we owe you a lot of gratitude, Jeff, for doing all the work, to parse through his immense amount of material and, call out the really important points of what he wrote. So I think that is really a wonderful thing that will benefit many.
Well, that's been a joy to do. I mean, he's my favorite. He's been my favorite for probably close to 30 years and has meant so much to me personally. So this has been a really fun project to work on.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for spending some time with us today. And we will really be looking forward to the introduction of this new book.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks for your help with it.